One group had 450 calories with carbohydrates coming from honey. Another group had exactly 450 calories with the exact same amount of carbohydrates in isoglucidic fashion, meaning the same glycemic index, but coming from sucrose. So it was honey versus sucrose when it came down to fat loss. And this is just one example. We'll break it down and then we'll talk about how honey has an impact on visceral fat by operating at the cortisol level. So we'll break it all down. Please don't forget to subscribe. We have videos every single day, and drop a comment down below for the algorithm. YouTube likes to see comments flooding in. Even if you got nothing to say, just say hello. Before I get into the details of that one particular study, we want to talk just generally. We've seen in other studies that honey seems to increase fat oxidation compared to other sugars. So it seems as though honey is not the same as regular sugar, which we've talked about probably ad nauseum on this channel. But when we look at this study, we start to see something else, and it starts to highlight what might be going on. Because when we look at carbohydrates and insulin, it's easy to kind of think carbohydrates are going to inhibit lipolysis. They're going to slow down fat loss. But that's not always the case, because we need to look at the big picture here. Sure, short term, there may be an inhibition of lipolysis when carbohydrates are ingested because there's an insulin spike. But long term, if we consume the right carbohydrates, we can actually stabilize insulin levels better by influencing more insulin sensitivity. And this is done so with the antioxidants that are in honey in the first place. So let's take a look at this Journal American Clinical Nutrition study. So again, they had subjects consume equal glycemic index carbohydrates. One group was honey, one group was sucrose. Both had 450 calories. They measured their glucose levels every 30 minutes along with other biomarkers for a number of hours. And what they found is that the honey group ended up having lower glucose levels. They ended up having less of a glucose spike over like almost every single period that they tested. Now, even more important than that, they had a delayed increase in ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and they had an increase in what is called PYY, which is very similar to GLP-1. It's a gut incretin that basically makes you satiated. So short term, there was less glucose spike. Long term, there was more satiety, less hunger. So the honey group ended up just consuming less. So they ultimately ended up in more of a fat loss mode than the group that didn't have the honey. That's what's wild. So even though there were carbohydrates in the mix, honey seemed to really kickstart this whole like fat oxidation phase, because if you're able to go longer without food, you're going to increase your fat oxidation levels. Now, what else is really interesting is there was another study that looked specifically at visceral fat. In this case, it was published in the Indian Journal of Experimental Biology. It was a rodent model study, but it gives us data that we can look at and sort of extrapolate into other areas. This study gave subjects either a 10% honey solution or a 90% honey solution for about 90 days. And what they found is that both groups that had honey ended up having a decrease in overall fat mass, but a significant decrease in visceral fat mass. And the group that had the 90% honey concentration had even more reduction in visceral fat mass. So how the heck is honey influencing visceral fat? Well, with that, we need to look at, of course, the insulin dynamics, but we also need to look at cortisol, which is something that we're going to talk about here. So just because you're burning carbs doesn't mean that you're not going to burn fat later on. If you're burning carbohydrates and you're having a hard time ever getting insulin sensitive again after that, then sure, it could be difficult to burn fat because you're taking such a long time and it's so hard to break down those carbohydrates and utilize them. Your glucose is staying high and you're inhibiting lipolysis, you're inhibiting fat burning. But if you can improve it at a higher level so that you do clear glucose faster and your area under the curve is less, then you are going to get into more of a fat burning stage faster. Interestingly enough, I put a link down below for a device called Lumen. This way you can test when you're in a fat burning stage, and you could actually test different foods. So you could, like, for example, have some sugar and you could see, breathe into the device. It's like a metabolic coach. You breathe into it, you could say, okay, hey, yes, I'm definitely burning carbs. It'll tell you on like a scale, you're burning carbs. And then you could test again maybe 30, 60, 90 minutes later and see if you're still burning carbs. And maybe it'll tell you you are, or maybe it'll tell you you're starting to burn fat, right? Then you could try it with honey And I've done this myself. I've seen that with honey, sure, right after I consume honey, I'm burning carbs, but about 30 minutes later, I'm right back into fat burning mode. And it just tells me, based on my own bioindividuality, that honey doesn't impede my fat oxidation like other carbohydrates do. And this is coming from someone that was formerly insulin resistant, and I was actually type 2 diabetic about 10 years ago when I was 300 pounds. So there's definitely something there. So anyhow, I put a link down below. Go to lumen.me/DeLauer. That's a 15% off discount link. So again, lumen.me/DeLauer gets you 15% off the Lumen device. So this is going to give you quite the playbook. It also teaches you how to use it. It teaches you when your body is burning fat, so when it's a good time to maybe go do fasted cardio or just cardio in general. Or it tells you when you're burning carbs, which might be a good time to go do some resistance training, so you're gonna oxidize more of the carbohydrates that way. It really teaches you the fundamentals and your body specifically. And you have things like a continuous glucose monitor, which is great, but the thing I like about Lumen is it tells you when you're actually in that fat burning stage a little bit more based on your alveolar air, so when you exhale into it. It's pretty interesting. So that link is down below. Once again, lumen.me/DeLauer. So if we go back to this journal experimental biology study, the other thing that was interesting is they found that honey protected against the formation of liver fat. What's interesting about this is that this tells us quite strongly that it has something to do with the antioxidant profile. So the antioxidant profile, the flavonoid, the phenolic compounds in honey are making it so that glucose excursion is better and you're also maybe having more insulin sensitivity. But let's go focus on visceral fat for just a moment. So that's what this video is really about for the most part. Visceral fat has a high affinity for cortisol. Okay, so cortisol is a stress hormone. It's good, bad, and ugly, and indifferent depending on the situation. But when cortisol levels are high, we are at a higher propensity to store visceral fat, okay? Because we have 4 times as many cortisol receptors in our visceral fat than anywhere else in the body. So that means when stress is high, cortisol is high, the potential for lipogenesis in the midsection and in the visceral fat area is significantly higher. Now, the way that we can kind of combat this right out the forefront is, well, how do we reduce cortisol levels a little bit more? We could talk about stress management, all that kind of stuff, but we've seen some evidence that honey has quite an impact on blunting cortisol. So with this, we see a study that was published in Biochemical Research, and they found that when honey was introduced, there was a rapid shutdown in the cortisol response. Now, mechanistically, there's a few reasons why this could be happening. For one, you're reducing oxidative stress. Oxidative stress, just like the name implies, is still a stress. Just because we can't see it, feel it, hear it, or touch it because it's inside our body doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? We think about stress and how it's impacting us externally, but there's stress going on inside that we may not have a feedback for immediately. But that oxidative stress is still stress, right? If you're chronically in a state of oxidative stress, that's going to be a problem, right? So the antioxidant profile of honey is going to bring that down. That alone is going to help. But then we've seen effects of the flavonoids and the antioxidants in honey directly impacting what is called the hypothalamic adrenal axis, so the HPA axis, which is the axis that influences adrenaline and cortisol and all this stuff. So you get stressed out or you have high circulating cortisol levels, well, balancing out that HPA axis is going to help sort of the cortisol production in the first place so that's happening in a healthier way that's manageable. So honey seems to directly influence this. Now, in addition to this, when your glucose goes high, this is going to be problematic for visceral fat or for liver fat accumulation. But we're seeing now, once again, that the antioxidants in honey increase insulin sensitivity so that the glucose comes down faster. As a matter of fact, there's a study published in Diabetologia that looked at mice. They took a look at insulin-resistant mice, and when they gave them antioxidants, it actually delayed the glucose response, and it ended up making their blood sugar lower by having antioxidants with carbohydrates because it increased insulin sensitivity. So again, it's not just about the carbs we have, it's about the insulin sensitivity that allows us to manage those carbs. So when we have antioxidants with honey, it's gonna make it so that even if we have a spike, it potentially globally comes down better and more long-term, thereby reducing the accumulation of visceral fat, which is highly metabolic and linked with high glucose as well. And then, of course, there is the gut-brain axis component as well. So there's a study published in Frontiers in Nutrition. There's a diagram on the screen right now. Essentially, when you consume honey, the indigestible components of it modulate our gut microbiome and actually directly inhibit the overall inflammatory response that can happen in the gut. This makes a big difference for visceral fat because gut inflammation and visceral fat are highly, highly linked because of what's called lipopolysaccharides. Not going to go into the detail of that right now. Bottom line is that it's not about the carbohydrates so much as it is about the compounds in honey that impact visceral fat, impact liver fat, and impact overall fat loss to begin with. But again, you need to test things out. That's why using something like a CGM or Lumen is a great tool because it's going to give you insight into your own bioindividuality. But I think we need to stop looking at food at surface level, just the macronutrients, protein, fats, and carbs. There's a heck of a lot more going on than just that. I'll see you tomorrow.